So welcome everyone to the webinar on epidemic ethics. Today's webinar is very timely. It's a grand experiment. What are our ethical responsibilities in the global rollout of COVID-19 vaccines? I'm Gagandeep Kang from the Christian Medical College in Vellore in southern India, and I'm going to be chairing this webinar. We have some really exciting, very involved speakers for the panel today, and I'm looking forward to the interaction with them and the interaction with you. We are living in a time which we couldn't have thought about last year. We didn't think that we would have vaccines in less than a year. And yet we are in a stage today where there are millions of doses of vaccines that are being rolled out every day, currently at 8 million a day and climbing. Now, if we think of the speed and the scale of the rollouts, this is hugely important in our response to the pandemic. And the decisions and the recommendations that we are making are being informed by the best science that is available to us. But what ethical responsibilities do we have to monitor the safety and the effectiveness of these vaccines, which are currently mostly all under emergency use authorizations and some which are still in clinical testing? Globally, when we are giving out these millions of vaccines every day, what mechanisms should there be to ensure that we have the capacity to monitor and evaluate the outcomes of vaccination, not just in the developed world, but also in low and middle income countries, which are increasingly beginning to use the vaccines. On the panel today, we have three outstanding speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Marc Lipsitch. He's from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in Boston. He's a professor of epidemiology, and I think everybody who's been tracking the epidemic and uses Twitter follows Marc. He is modeling the transmission of COVID-19 and has been very involved in measurement of the impact of COVID-19 vaccines, including the recently published study about the impact of the Pfizer vaccine in Israel. Professor Derso Greco is from the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Belo Horizonte in Brazil. He is Professor Emeritus of Internal Medicine and Infectious Disease at the School of Medicine. He's an authority on infectious diseases and parasites, clinical immunology and ethics, and he is president of the Brazilian Society of Bioethics. Dr. Pearson Nakoma is from the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Unit in Blantyre, Malawi. Pearson is the co-investigator of the Malawi Health Utilization Study, which is part of the malaria vaccine implementation program, which is being conducted currently in Malawi, Kenya, and Ghana. Through this study, he's exploring the behavioral impact and acceptability of COVID-19 vaccines at the community level and how it's impacting acceptability of new and old vaccines. He has been offering regular inputs and real-time feedback based on his results to WHO as well as to the Ministry of Health in Malawi. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And I'd like to invite each of the panelists to make opening remarks. We'll start with Marc. I think Marc and Derso have slides for the presentation.
Thank you, Cherry, and thank you to the organizers for the chance to be here. It's a fascinating and timely, as was mentioned, discussion and a wonderful group of people to discuss with. We've been asked some very complicated questions, and none of us, well, I'll speak for myself, I will not be able to answer them all satisfactorily. But what I will try to do is to frame them and then to provide one way of thinking about them. As I see it, the questions before us are essentially a classic dilemma between two imperatives. One, to roll out vaccines as rapidly and equitably and widely as possible to save the most lives possible. And secondly, to ensure that during that rollout, we maintain the assurance that we currently have for each vaccine that it is safe and effective in the populations and in the conditions where it's being used. And because each of those requires enormous resources, and because resources are limited, this is a conflict. And if nothing else, time is limited, even if we had all the money in the world. So that's the conflict of two very important goals. And the question is how to try to reconcile them. So I think I see all of this as falling in the context of really a broader responsibility that each government and that the international community together bear. And that is surveillance. If I found this report from the WHO a few years ago on the ethics of public health surveillance one of the most sort of enlightening and mind-changing pieces of writing that I've read in a long time. And what it says is that surveillance to ensure that we know who is well and who is sick and why they're getting sick, and whether the interventions are reaching people is a national responsibility. And I've taken 3 of the several guidelines that were proposed in this report. The first saying that countries have an obligation to develop appropriate, feasible, sustainable public health systems for surveillance with a clear purpose and plan. Countries have an obligation to make sure those data are good enough quality, and that the global community has an obligation to support countries that lack adequate resources to undertake surveillance. So surveillance is much broader, of course, than vaccine safety and effectiveness. But I think this framework is actually very helpful in thinking about what needs to be done. Also, I want to draw attention to a report that was just issued by a WHO group led by Minal Patel and Danny Fiken, with participation of about several dozen of us, that that lays out some ways on the effectiveness side that proper surveillance can and studies, research studies can be done post-vaccine, post-licensure, sorry, that should say post-licensure effectiveness evaluation. And the premise of this report is that it's possible to do anywhere, but it needs to be done with sufficient resources and infrastructure in order to ensure some of those goals that were listed on the last slide. So I think the questions that I see as underlying all of this is, why do we want to know things post-licensure, post-authorization? Why do we want to monitor these vaccines? And this is a long list. I'm sure you may think of some others that could be added to this list, but I think not all of these are equally compelling, but these are the ones that came to my mind. On the safety side, we need to know about long-term safety because the trials included only approximately 2 months of follow-up for a typical participant, and we want to know about safety over the longer term. Also, trials are intrinsically limited. The randomized clinical trials are intrinsically limited by their size. They're very large, but they're still in the only tens of thousands. So if there's an adverse event that affects 1 in a million people or 1 even in 100,000 people, it's unlikely to be detected in a trial. And so for rare adverse events, we need follow-up studies. In addition, there are local safety concerns. There may be safety concerns that are unique to populations that were not included in the trials. So if the trial had been done in that population, we would have seen it, but it wasn't. and we're extrapolating and need to make sure that extrapolation is correct. On the effectiveness side, we have the issues of duration of immunity, or whether it wanes, whether there may be some kind of disease enhancement over the long term. And there's again, only 2 months of follow-up or so in most of the trials, so we can't know that from the trials. Also, there may be local influences on effectiveness, the nutritional status of the population, the adherence to the cold chain, the presence of other pathogens, and other factors. And finally, an issue that's evolving over time, quite literally, is the impact of SARS-CoV-2 variants on effectiveness. So what I would propose as a way of thinking about this problem is that local evaluation, meaning evaluation in as many places as possible, should prioritize intrinsically local questions, while other questions, which are more global in some sense, can borrow more information across borders. So of particularly local concern, meaning it may be different in different populations, and we should study it as widely as possible, are issues of local safety, if there are some issues that may pop up in one population but not another. Issues of local influences on effectiveness, and issues of the impact of variants on effectiveness. Those are things that we just need to keep studying as widely as resources allow. So under this model, the project of continuing to monitor vaccines is a global one, with different countries contributing according to their specific conditions and resources. And that involves the global community through the World Health Organization and other groups sharing best practices for local efforts. And I think we've already seen that global issues may become evident first in one country. So for example, the UK and Israel have provided data on vaccine effectiveness against the B.1.1.7 variant. South Africa has provided data on B.1.351 and vaccines. And these are issues that will now become relevant to many other countries as these variants spread. So it was critical that we had those widespread sites for trials early on to catch these, and we will undoubtedly, unfortunately, see more of that. On the other hand, issues of long-term safety and effectiveness could perhaps, and I invite discussion on this point, be studied in a handful of countries and extrapolated unless there's a specific reason to expect that long-term issues will differ by country. Finally, I want to mention that a few closing thoughts. First, that with remarkably high efficacy and short-term safety, there is a very strong case to roll out these vaccines rapidly with as much monitoring as place as possible, but prioritizing access over continued study. There's an absolute need for high quality studies because a spurious safety signal can undermine confidence, while biased effectiveness estimates could similarly drive poor decisions. And one of the pieces of the interim guidance that I was quite strongly in favor of including was this table in the recent report that came out last week or the week before of how to interpret what may be disparate estimates from different vaccine effectiveness and efficacy trials. So sometimes that's because the new estimate is correct and it's truly different, and sometimes it's because of some sort of bias. And so the critical thing will be, as we see new signs, to evaluate those two possibilities. And last, as usual, a call for clear communication. I think we've already seen with some examples in the last weeks, the importance of distinguishing a warning sign and an abundance of caution by regulators from a firm conclusion, and trying to make that as clear to the global public as possible. So I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Marc. I think that was a very useful framing. And we'll move now to Professor Derso Greco, and he is uniquely situated to talk about pandemic-burdened health systems and what we need to be doing to monitor rollout of vaccines when the health system is already really stretched.
Well, thank you. It's very nice to meet all of you, to see Catherine again after almost 4 days. And I want first to congratulate the Global Health Bioethics Network for such a timely and important debate. And of course, I'm in a position that I'm not at all proud of being in it. I'm in Brazil. I'm going to show you a little bit of it. And I think this discussion is a very, well, I think you mentioned that in the beginning. I don't think it's possible in 1 hour to tackle all the important things that we have, but I think it's a good start, and I hope that we can do it more frequently. What I wrote in the first slide was what I expect, is the respect and protection of human dignity. Everything aiming at assuring equalitarian access to healthcare and public health emergencies. I think all of us think the same, so it's nothing new. Just a biography sketch you mentioned about me. I come from Belo Horizonte in Brazil. I chair the Brazilian Society of Bioethics, and now I'm a member of the International Bioethics Committee, and I'm very proud to be with Catherine at the WHO ACT Ethics Working Group since 2020. And I declare no current possible conflict of interest in relation to my presentation. Most of you know, but Brazil is such a huge country. It's a very rich country with a lot of poor people. And that, I think that's the main, I think that's the way that when the COVID hit, we were facing so many difficulties. I think COVID was not just because it just seems to be very little, but was one more problem that we had to tackle. And we're facing a right-wing government that has been trying everything to make the situation worse in the country. I can say that, I repeat that everywhere, so there's no problem being recorded. And especially in a country that with all this money, 1.86 trillion of GDP, has more, now I think it's about 13 people living in complete poverty, spread throughout this big country. And just to localize me, I'm here in Belo Horizonte, in about 300 miles from Rio, 300 miles from São Paulo. And for us, COVID is really a big problem. And I just, it's a confused slide, but I want just to take you through part of it. It's Brazil has 12 million cases as of 2 days ago, with 312,000 deaths. Almost impossible to think that could happen in such a short time, with 136 deaths per million compared to 24 in the UK. And vaccine has been started in February, end of February. We had vaccinated only 2.9% to 2 doses of the population. And that's a little bit more than the word, but the disparity here is unbelievable because as I remember, 130 countries or something like that had not accessed any vaccine at all. So that's a good point. And I quite agree with most of the things. I think everything that Marc said and how can we tackle part of that. But I think the inequality must be the fighting against. Brazil has something that's a little bit better than other countries. I think that's nice to tell you, because we have one unified health system. That's amazing in a country that's so disparate. 210 million people have access, and I'm just showing a little, some of this is very confused slide too, but it's just to remember that all antiretroviral drugs and all hepatitis treatment, everything is funded exclusively by municipal, state, and federal monies. No money from the outside, no money is taken out of the pocket to make this happen. And luckily, having that, the barbaric situation we're facing the last 2 years, it's not chaotic still because of that, even being underfunding at this time. And The role of bioethics in public health, and I put here as the conclusion, but it's not really a conclusion, but I think we have more and more to discuss how to provide access to all efficacious progress of research in public health. And of course, I'm completely agreeing with Marc saying that we have not only to deploy, but we have to follow it up. We have this kind of confusing who do have to follow and to keep this on track. Okay, this I'm not going to show you. So there are two questions that I summarized here that came to us. What kind of responsibilities arise to evaluate the vaccine? Probably most of it was supposed to be post-licensure, but I think some of them are pre-licensure, because we have to decide what do we mean when we decide that the vaccine is ready to roll out? And there's a lot of pressure, including conflict of interest. You remember some of the vaccines that they had released data that was very premature. Of course, with that, the cost of the value of the company increased about 10% in 1 day. So that's the thing that we have to tackle also. How should pandemic burden health systems globally prioritize vaccine rollout? I think that's the $500 million question, because most of the health systems globally, at least in the last 5 years, are completely burdened, underfinanced. And of course, so what I'm saying, it's so clear, I think most people would agree with that, it has to be a global effort and with the support of national health systems. But if we go through what's happening in the world, and I always like to quote the WHO DG saying about when he said he had to be blunt, because people have been saying that they are going to do it together. But the rich countries are buying vaccines, are doing the bilateral agreements with the companies, and most of them do not even get through WHO. So that's a thing that we have, all of us have to be together to counteract that. And the last question, is the existing evidence of safety and efficacy sufficient to justify? Yeah, I made it very simple. And Marc said that we are not able to answer those questions, not even in more time. It's such a complicated situation. But what I can say, saying as a physician, as an infectious disease person, and as a bioethicist, is that the clinical trial results were very satisfactory when we had it together. But we don't really know all the data. And that's another thing that's we have to press also, is to make everything available, all the data from the research available to scrutiny. And not only that, I'm going to show you one more thing that we have been fighting for. But here, the clinical trial results were satisfactory and justified regulatory approval. But real lifetime monitoring, as in previous situations, that's not new with COVID, is undoubtedly a priority. Global, with WHO as a main actor, in my opinion, and with the involvement of our stakeholders, and mostly should be financed by the big pharma, because they're the ones that now they're making so much money with this. Can you imagine 8 billion doses are going to be released? We don't know how long that's going to take, and they're still selling the vaccines, patent. The perspectives, I'm going to finish soon with that. There are many. One is clear communication. I think we have to be very clear, and I like very much to know that the Global Health Biotic Network has a database that can be used with all the things that I've introduced, and I think that's very nice to have. It's almost as the same as the clinical trial Gov, or the clinical trial that WHO has. We have to put everything there so people can look, can read, can scrutinize, and then we may be even able to counteract fake news. And then, of course, second is almost obvious. Prioritize spending health, even with increased economic difficulties, which were prior. And that's the point. They're prior, but they got worse by the pandemic. And this third one, and we have been fighting for that, is facilitate the production of vaccines worldwide. A patent ban and dissemination of know-how, how to produce it, it's part now of one of the main, not the main discussion, but it's getting momentum. And of course, some things to help. And we have mentioned that not only the public health systems are completely underfinanced, but people are underfinanced. So again, if we think we can control this pandemic by immunizing people, of course, it's a fantastic, and that's amazing how the science in 1 year was able to produce so much progress. But without people having income, that's going to be almost impossible when you think of the most vulnerable throughout the world. And I can say that clearly from Brazil. And I think in India, we have so many things in common with India, big countries, very rich with so much poor people. And I think that would be a good thing, a good start. And of course, things that's not in my mandate. It's get the money to do that, and maybe 2 things have maybe done, but that depends on the countries. And I think, just to see, I mentioned that the ban on patenting, and that's a proposal that's being discussed at WTO with India and South Africa in front. Were the first that proposed that, and unfortunately, for you to see the situation in Brazil, now Brazil voted against that. That's almost incredible, but that's what's happening with us here. And the Brazilian Society of Bioethics just released a position paper. I have just sent it to Catherine a week ago, and I'm going to send to Professor Gagandeep also, because I think it may be added to your database. And in conclusion, and I think that's a big conclusion. I don't think we have really a conclusion for that, but maybe one thing we can do, and this has happening, is the worldwide confrontation of AIDS can be considered a global health model. It's amazing. 35 years ago, we were facing almost the same. And the difference was that for HIV, it's not controlled. We just take it for granted. Now it's epidemic, it's endemic, it's everywhere still. But the global health model that came after the confrontation of HIV can be used in a way. And to effectively combat COVID-19, the lessons previously learned with HIV in both research and public health may be used, can be used, it should be used to counteract isolationism, boost international solidarity with the participation of all relevant stakeholders, and to confront anti-science, anti-vaccine movements, to adequately finance science and quality public health accessible to all, and of course include everything that Marc mentioned, how to follow up and how to take care of this amount of vaccines that we don't know exactly what are going to happen with them after being released throughout the world. We hope it's going to be throughout the whole world. This will need strong cooperation among all stakeholders, I think, and I defend that most of the time with WHO leadership, adequate financing, respect for and participation of individuals, communities, governments, university research, and health professionals. And as I mentioned, it has to be financed also by the ones that have been gaining so much money by releasing this vaccine, and I'm talking about Big Pharma. And just to finish, I think that only together will be possible to address the social determinants of health that have facilitated the establishment and spread of the current syndemia, and to prepare, of course, to confrontation of others that certainly will come. I think that was the last one. I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I hope we can have a strong discussion afterwards. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Greco. I think you've highlighted the bigger picture of how global engagement needs to play out, even as we think about local use of vaccines. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Pearson Nokoma. I think thinking about prioritizing the rollout when you also have to look at safety and effectiveness data really requires community engagement, and I look forward to hearing your perspective.
Thank you very much for having me today, and welcome to everyone here. Basically, in my presentation, I will focus more on the contextual element with regards to vaccine rolling out, and the sort of the global political economy around this, especially with regards to countries like Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, and the future of vaccines based on the experiences of COVID vaccine, COVID-19, as well as COVID vaccine, how we've managed to come up with different vaccines for COVID, and what that means for outbreaks that will come and to have an impact globally or just a certain regions of the world. So briefly, I'll talk about where I come from. Malawi basically is in sub-Saharan Africa with a population of just over 18 million. It's one of, as I mentioned, it's not something that we are proud of, but it is what it is, I would say, one of the poorest countries. The majority of the country, of the population live in rural areas. A majority of this population are not well educated. The level of literacy is quite low. With regards to COVID-19, we've had close to 220 suspected cases, 220,000 suspected cases, but confirmed cases so far have been just slightly over 100,000. I mean, yeah, 33,000, but we've had good recovery of 29,000. The country is targeting to have few positive cases. At the moment, vaccination started about 2 weeks ago, and we've successfully managed to vaccinate over 110,000. But the approach is a bit different with regards to how people have been vaccinated here in Malawi with regards to other countries where certain age groups were the primary target. But here, I think it's been opened to everyone who is willing to be vaccinated. On this particular slide, I'll talk about the precautionary principles of rolling out the vaccine, and I'm looking at the ambiguous agency, especially where some people are making quite difficult choices whether to vaccinate or not, and what that means when it comes to rolling out vaccines. Basically, I should mention that there's been a lot of mistrust around both COVID-19 as an outbreak, as well as the COVID-19 vaccine, where people are questioning the sort of credibility of this vaccine, drawing on memories of the colonial era, where the global south was mostly used as guinea pigs. And that has had implications on that level of mistrust and the current level of mistrust with regards to how politicians in the global south, for example, here in Malawi, where we had other politicians saying that there was no COVID-19 when the outbreak was had just been confirmed. In countries like Tanzania, where it was clearly said that there was no COVID-19, and Malawi and Tanzania are neighbors with lots of movement of people between the two countries. And we had a case where the president was vaccinated publicly, but people clearly in different parts of the country saying that we don't think he's been vaccinated with a COVID-19. Possibly he's just been jabbed with water. Those were sort of reports that people were saying publicly on the president's official Facebook page. And then something that I also want to draw your attention to is the Malawi's healthy systems, which has its own challenges, and looking at how the vaccine has been rolled out in different parts, where other people have highlighted to say that this could also be a bleeding ground of vaccine, because there's lots of population since it's been open to everyone, and not having the sort of, I think, a clear documentation of possible IFEs or ISEs with regards to the vaccine. And much as people are being informed of the possible effects of having the vaccine, it's not, I don't think there's been a clear mention to say, have we had cases of possible adverse effects or not? And with regards to reports that other countries had suspended the vaccine, that had a sort of an impact on the country. And what I want to highlight to you is where the vaccine is rolled out, but people are not fully informed of what could be the possible impact or what challenges other countries are facing that other people within the country might face. So that sort of what I would call an element of withholding information might as well create mistrust in the public to say, okay, what is it about this vaccine? And then what is it about other vaccines? So I think I'll just briefly talk about what I'm referring to as the hoarding of vaccines by the Global North, and then where, for example, Malawi, the vaccine that it has been accessed through the COVAX. We haven't managed to buy it, but you can see that even through COVAX, it hasn't managed to get all the vaccine that it's demanding or it's procured. But compare that with other countries in the Global North that have been able to access more despite having a small number of population compared to countries in the Global South that are accessing the vaccine through the COVAX system. And then how people look at that to say, okay, other outbreaks that are coming, or even previous outbreaks that have been there, our country is not committed to drawing vaccines or coming up with vaccines, because this is only affecting other regions in the world. So there are all those what I would regard as ethical questions around vaccines, and then that impact on the acceptability, not only of this vaccine, but also of future vaccines. For example, I would say with COVID-19, there are a couple of vaccines that have all been given a sort of a green light for rolling out. But when you look at where these vaccines are sort of concentrated, you will see that the Global South countries are not sort of considered to be a priority, but that can drive back to our sort of what we are with regards to, do we have the capacity to buy, or how should vaccines in the future be made accessible to all other countries, or are some countries more important when it comes to outbreak? Which position do we occupy in the Global South when it comes to outbreaks or vaccines that are formulated for such? such outbreaks. And then with all that, there is the level of skepticism as well as acceptability at play when it comes to vaccines being only concentrated in different parts of the world, in different regions and not in other regions based on the financial status of those countries, especially countries in the global south. So I think mostly what I'm bringing to this group is the level of the practical lessons around acceptability or skepticism, especially in the global south, when it comes to rolling out the vaccine, this vaccine or other vaccines that may be developed, and which is the best approach to ensure that access to such vaccines should be regarded within principles of health justice, or be regarded as a financial making system for countries in the global north. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Pearson. I think we had very complimentary presentations from all the three speakers. And we can move now to the very interesting set of questions that we have been sent by people who are attending this webinar. And I'd like to invite the speakers to turn on their video cameras and their microphones. And I'll direct the first question to Pearson and welcome responses from the other panelists as well. So the first question is, how can governments of poorer countries like Malawi balance the dilemma between the rollout and ensuring the safety of these vaccines? So I think we all know that in many developing countries, there is an issue with the monitoring of adverse events that follow immunization. And yet, if you're prioritizing the rollout, then it can be challenging to try and do both together.
Thank you for that question. I think at the moment, what I can say is it's a question of right to life in the first place, to say, okay, looking at the experiences of rolling out in other countries, how do we roll out vaccines to save lives in our own country? And what are challenges that other countries have experienced in their own rollout? What are other adverse events that have been reported in other countries? And then I think before rolling out, it is crucial to empower the healthcare personnel to ensure that they are well equipped with the information with regards to the experiences that has been reported in other countries, and how to document some of the IFEs with regards to the vaccine that is being rolled out. Unfortunately, I think I had a small chat with other healthcare workers, and they clearly indicated that, of course, the attention at the moment has been on COVID and COVID-19 vaccine, but there hasn't been strong empowering on their capacity to say, okay, this is how you have to document. And at the higher level within the system is to ensure that all the documented IFEs are also made public so that people are able to make an informed decision to say, okay, based on these challenges, highlighting the need to save lives, I think I can make an informed choice to present myself for vaccination. There were cases where people were clearly saying would not go for, would not go to be vaccinated. But things changed when they noticed that the cases being reported in other countries were very few compared to the number of people being vaccinated. But that hasn't been, I think, the case in Malawi. But what I would say, before I call other colleagues maybe for a comment, is it is important to make the information public, let people be aware of the gains as well as some of the challenges, some of the possible IFEs associated with this particular vaccine, not just generalizing all IFEs, etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Pearson. I think you've already addressed part of a question that is in the chat, which is about public hesitancy for COVID-19 vaccines and how the health system is countering public mistrust. So if you could quickly respond to that, just about, is the Malawian health system doing anything about mistrust of vaccines? And I'll ask the same question of Professor Greco.
I think quickly, the public mistrust on the vaccine has been driven also by the politics around COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccine with here in Malawi, I would say. So I had a chance to move around in some parts of Malawi where people clearly said some of our senior politicians had indicated that there's no COVID-19. And then the question that comes in is, how do you come up with a vaccine of something that does not exist? So basically, I think that do we have the political will to fight that mistrust? I would also give a very good example. At the moment, much as we are acknowledging that there is now COVID-19 and acknowledging the need to vaccinate population, there are by-elections in different parts of Malawi. And politicians, both in opposition and the ruling party, have disregarded COVID-19 guidelines to safeguard the population. People in these places, which can be considered breeding ground for vaccines, not following all the guidelines. And that—
Thank you, Pearson.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a problem that is common to many of our countries. So I'd like to invite Professor Greco and Professor Lipsitch to address the same question around what is it that we should be doing to counter mistrust. So first, Professor Greco, I think you have a particular challenge in Brazil.
Yes, yes, thank you very much. So we have had, because I have mentioned that before, but when the first vaccine was prepared to roll out, was the CoronaVac. That was a joint venture between China and the Brazilian official laboratory. And the president was completely against because of political issues with the governor of São Paulo, where the factory is. And he said people are going to be transformed in alligators if they took the vaccine. He was kidding, but he said that to everyone that could hear, and many people that followed him said, well, I'm not going to take this one. But luckily, when the two vaccines started to being rolled out, the acceptance had gone up. And what we have been doing, especially the Brazilian institutions, not exactly the Brazilian Ministry of Health, is going to all debates and trying to show people the importance of this vaccination if expect to control. It's a situation that's very difficult. We have to keep pushing because fake news are much harder and much faster to be distributed. But I want to go back, and if you permit me, to the first part of the question about how can we do to follow it up, especially in countries where there are difficulties in doing that. What I can do, and I can ask Marc about that, how they have been doing in the United States for other health products. Usually it's the same laboratory that produces, he wants to have a pharmacovigilance or a phase 4 follow-up, because that's good for them. It's good for confirming, and we can talk about it when we remember thalidomide. That was after a long time being released. So I think that we have to push for maybe, and agreeing with Marc, maybe not to do it everywhere, but to have pharmacovigilance established just before the rollout, with the financing both from the national government and from the companies that produce the drugs. Maybe we can circumvent this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Greco. Marc?
Yeah, thank you. I would agree with Professor Greco's comment at the end there. I would just add that in some sense, we have a wonderful opportunity that every country in the world, to one degree or another, is trying to roll out the vaccine. And so there are many sites to study, but we also have a lot of different vaccines, which are not all the same as each other. And so that means that it's that what we really need is kind of multiple parallel research programs for safety and effectiveness. I wanted to address the question about hesitancy, because from my perspective in the United States, we've been exemplifying a lot of very lazy thinking about hesitancy. So roughly speaking, the narrative in the United States began some 6 months or so ago by saying African Americans are hesitant about the vaccine because of histories of unethical experimentation on African Americans. That then became every by association, every non-white person is hesitant about vaccines. Then there was some pushback, at least that I heard, saying no, in fact, certain especially immigrant groups are actually quite anxious to get the vaccine. And then recently, survey data showed that, in fact, the most hesitant groups are rural white Americans who voted for Trump. And so at each stage, there's been a kernel of truth about what's driving hesitancy. It's probably quite a different phenomenon in all these different groups, but I think the response has been very often assuming it's one thing rather than many things. Some of it driven by history, some of it driven by active mischief from the anti-vaccine movement, and some of it driven by other reasons. And so I think I would just encourage other countries to be smarter than the United States has been so far, I think, in doing social science as much as possible to understand hesitancy and not assuming that it's the province of one group, and similarly not assuming that every member of one group thinks the same as other members of that group. It's just, we don't think that way we shouldn't think that way in any other realm. And I think vaccine hesitancy, because it's such a puzzling phenomenon for those of us who work on vaccines, has not been as carefully characterized as it should be.
Thank you, Marc.
Yeah, just one point, just to agree with Marc, because exactly like they had Trump, we have Bolsonaro, and people that have been following him are the ones mostly that are with vaccine hesitancy. Luckily, you got rid of one, but we have not yet. So we have another similar things to fight together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Greco. I'm going to ask all the panelists to respond in bullet points because I really want to get a lot more out of them. And I have 2 questions for each of you. We've covered the issue of vaccine hesitancy and communication to some extent. But what I'd like to focus on is really one question on politics and one on science. It's impossible to have short answers, but I know you will give it a go. And the question on politics is, we've seen vaccine nationalism, and there is a difference between wanting to protect your country and being a global citizen. How should we be responding to that? And the question on science is, we still have a lot of vaccines to come. And what is really the future of testing new vaccines going to look like? Are we really going to use parts of the world that don't have vaccines rolled out to potentially do placebo-controlled trials? Or is that not going to be the case? So perhaps we can go in the order of Professor Greco, Dr. Nikoma, and then end with Marc.
Thank you. Two easy questions, very difficult answers. Of course, the first one I think is a little bit easier because nationalism, I think it's a point that we have all to fight against. And most in this time, I think we have to be with WHO, and I think their position now it's very good. And theoretically, most countries are involved in WHO, even the United States is coming back. So I think that's a place where you should discuss that and put it clear that we have to follow rules, and the rules are well established. I think that's a short answer. The second one is very difficult. Lots of vaccines to come. Yes, we have now maybe, I don't know how many we're going to need, but maybe they're coming a lot. And this discussion about placebo, it's a very hot issue, and I have a very strong position for many years. I participate in all the discussions of the Declaration of Helsinki when they changed this big obligation not to use placebo and when you have a control. And one point that I'm very much against is that when you go to countries where they don't have vaccine to use placebo, that's double standard, very clear. So the point I think, and we have been writing about that, there's a document from the Brazilian Society of Bioethics saying that if we're going to test the same population, same age, same health situation, and we have vaccine, they should be tested with an active control. But there are many things to be done, of course. We don't know about children. We don't know about pregnant. Maybe we still don't know about many of the non-risky population between 18 and 24, 35. So we still have a window of opportunity that's going to be closed as long as we have more vaccines to be tested. That's the Brazilian Society of Bioethics position today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Greco. And Pearson, to you. Bullet points only because we've got 2 minutes.
I think I agree with Professor Greco to say we need to continue preparing for possible outbreaks. And that means continuing with trials in different populations so that we are not caught off guard. And that's on science. On the issue of nationalization of vaccines, I think there should be some set of guidelines to say, how do we make sure that vaccines in the future or even now are not used for profit, especially with regards to countries in the global south, countries that are quite underprivileged. So I think countries should set guidelines through WHO and other set global strategic bodies. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marc?
Sure. I put in the chat a reference link to a paper that I wrote with a colleague on the last topic, which I won't address for reasons of time. On the question of nationalism, I think there are no easy answers, and I think that the only things I can see for this pandemic are to grow the supply and find as many ways to make more versions of the vaccines available as possible while still maintaining quality. And people have emphasized that licensing technology and technology transfer is not simple, and that the last thing we want to do is to encourage development of manufacturing of vaccines at less than high quality. But within that constraint, I think that's the only thing to do now. I think we got caught a year or two sooner than we really had a good way to try to address this problem. And there were heroic efforts made. It hasn't been completely successful. And I think this has to be one of the top priorities for the future, is to figure out how we're going to do this better the next time.
Thank Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank all of the panelists for their insight and their wisdom. We started with Marc, who told us to focus on local evaluations for local questions. Professor Greco emphasized the importance of respect, access, communication, and solidarity. And then Pearson brought home to us how different it has really been in developing countries and all the issues that we need to be considering when we think about vaccines being used in countries with very, very limited resources. So I'd like to just let you all know that this session was recorded and will be available. A link is available in the chat box, but it will also be available on the Epidemic Ethics website at the Global Health Network. Please check the website for new seminars and for a new format on workshops that is going to be started from this year onwards. So thank you all very much for joining us, and keep joining webinars in the future.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks very much. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.
Let's keep in touch. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
and bye.
Bye.